We'll go ahead and get this meeting started. First of all, good morning and welcome to the Joint Legislative Audit Committee Oversight Hearing. The topic of today's hearing is the State Audit Report on the University of California student enrollment, its budget, and executive compensation. First, I have to say that I'm very supportive of the University of California and all its commitments and contributions. However, I was shocked to read the auditor's conclusion that UC's policies have disadvantaged and failed to put California students first. About a year ago, this committee convened an oversight hearing to discuss the university's increase in non-resident enrollment and the disparity in its per-student funding at the campuses, particularly those campuses with the highest proportion of minority students. Sadly, we are here today with an audit report that confirms what many of us have speculated. Our premier public institution of higher education is not putting our California students first. The auditor's finding that the university is displacing California students by increasing the number of out-of-state and international students it admits is simply not acceptable. One of the areas of the auditor's report is that most troubling to me is that the university's decision to lower the admission standards for non-resident students. To incentivize the campuses to recruit and enroll more non-resident students to backfill that unprecedented state budget cuts in one thing, but increasing the number of less qualified non-resident students, this is unacceptable. The university strongly disagrees with the state auditor's findings and conclusions in her audit report. In fact, the university contends that their policies overwhelmingly favor California students. The same day the state auditor released the report, the UC issued its own report, Straight Talk on Hot-Button Issues, addressing its admissions, finances, and transparency. The auditor's report and the UC report are both on the committee's website. The goal of today's hearing is to explore the question, did the university admissions and finance policies disadvantage California students? I am not going to spend any more time on opening comments. The audit report contains a lot of critical findings, and I want to serve as much time as possible to discuss them with our state auditor and the University of California representatives. I also want to hear from the president of the UC Student Association. Before I open up to other members for brief opening comments, I have a few housekeeping items to ensure that we hear from everyone here today. I ask that the panelists keep their presentation to the time allocated, 20 minutes for the state auditor, 20 minutes for the university representatives, and 5 minutes for the student president. Members, we will have time to ask questions at the completion of each panel's presentation. We will reserve time for public comment at the end. Members, I ask that you be mindful and use our time wisely as to the questions asked. With that, I would like to acknowledge Assemblymember Gibson for requesting this audit and ask him for brief opening comments. I also want to thank and acknowledge the chairs of the Assembly and Senate Policy and Budget Committees that I've invited here today. Members, please keep your opening comments brief so that way we can get to the panel discussions. Assemblymember Gibson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to my colleagues. Let me just keep my comments, as you indicated, very, very brief. I requested this audit to be done in 2015, and as the chairman has already indicated, he was startled, I was pissed by what the auditor has revealed, and not only what she revealed, but how California students have been disenfranchised by the University of California. But I have made my comments and my displeasure very, very public and very well known as it relates to this report. I think it is a slap in the face, not only of the members of the legislature, but also of the taxpayers of the state of California based on this audit report. And to further drive that message home in conclusion, to have the university take a position that the audit report was flawed or influenced in some kind of way, I take exception to that. This auditor is certainly very independent, very skillful, and has done an impeccable job while she has been the state auditor in this particular position. She has, when she has her findings in her report, she releases her report and findings at the same time the entire public receive it. We don't get any advance copy of it. We don't get any advance briefing on, here's her heads up or something like that. When she's hit the send button, it goes out to myself, other members of the legislature, and the entire world. And so to suggest that somehow that it was influence, no, it wasn't influence. The university has done a very poor job. And I'm glad that, one, that we're having this hearing to have a robust discussion. And Mr. Chair, I want to thank you very much for your leadership for bringing us all together today to have this very robust discussion so that we can get to the bottom of this, some questions answered, and hopefully the President, Ms. Napolitano, is here as well that can answer and address some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other members who'd like to share for your opening remarks or comments? Seeing none, we'll move forward with our first presentation. I ask that the State Auditor and her staff come forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. For the record, my name is Elaine Howell. I'm the California State Auditor. To my left is Mr. John Beyer. Mr. Beyer was the audit manager on this particular project, and to my right is Ms. Kathleen Fullerton. She was the team lead on this particular project, working with the audit staff both at the Office of the President and at the campuses we visited. I hope you all have the handout that we gave to the Sergeant to share. It's graphics that we excerpts from the audit report. It will follow along with my presentation with respect to the findings that we had in the audit report that we issued last week. So as you indicated, Mr. Chair, the overall broad conclusion of this audit is that the admissions and financial decisions that the University of California has made in the past few years have really disadvantaged California resident students. And I will step you through a variety of decisions that were made, policies that were changed, and then the effect of those policies, how we reached our conclusion, which, again, I just stated that California residents were disadvantaged. So in looking at the first graphic in your package, Figure 5, this is a graphic that demonstrates non-residents, the University of California admitting and enrolling increasing number of non-resident undergraduates. And as you can see with the two red circles that we highlight, we really focused on, in the last 5 years, the increase in the number of non-residents admitted to the University of California has increased by 182%. In addition, the number of non-residents enrolling in the University of California in the last 5 years has increased over 200%. So in looking at that, what were some of the policy decisions that the university made? Two key decisions that were made in 2008, procedural decisions. First of all, the university decided to allow campuses to retain their non-resident tuition, the supplemental tuition revenue that is generated at each individual campus by enrolling non-resident students. In addition, in 2008, the university allowed campuses to establish separate enrollment targets, one enrollment target for resident students and a separate enrollment target for non-resident students. And the campuses that really benefited from these decisions right out the gate are our flagship schools, Berkeley, Los Angeles, and San Diego, because they already had a pre-existing ability to attract non-residents, and that's important to note as we move through some of the other figures. In addition, in 2008, the university also, when they informed the campuses that they could retain their tuition, their non-resident supplemental tuition, establish separate enrollment targets, the university also let the campuses know that if there's any lost revenue, if you modify your non-resident enrollment targets and reduce them, you will be, as a campus, responsible for making up the loss of that revenue. So the UCOP is essentially letting the campuses know these are decisions that you need to make at the campus level, and if you choose to reduce the number of non-residents and you lose revenue, it's on you. The second policy, so those two policy decisions occurred in 2008, and on the figure 5, that's what we show. The next policy decision that was a key one is the red on Figure 5 again, compare favorably. This was a decision that was made in 2011, and it was made by the Board of Admissions and Relations with Schools, BORS, as familiar. And prior to 2011, a non-resident student trying to gain admittance to the University of California had to demonstrate academic qualifications that were comparable to the upper half of California high school graduates. In 2011, they modified that requirement to say that non-resident students had to compare favorably. And what they also allowed is essentially let, again, the campuses make that determination as to what does compare favorably mean. It's no longer necessary for a non-resident to be competing with the upper half California residents graduating from high school here in California, trying to gain acceptance to the system. The next action that the university took is to slow enrollment growth, in particular resident enrollment growth. And one of the strategies that the university engaged in, and we'll talk about it a little bit in a few minutes, is admitting resident students or denying their campus of choice. So increasing the number of non-resident students. So to meet the master plan, the university needs to admit the upper 12.5% of high school graduates in California. Well, admitting is not equivalent to enrolling. So to meet the master plan, the university could admit an individual to the system, but deny that individual the campus or campuses of choice. So, for example, if I applied for admittance to the University of California and I wanted to go to either UC Davis or UC Berkeley, and the university said, yeah, congratulations, Elaine, you've been admitted to the university system. However, we are referring you to an alternative campus, and that campus is UC Merced. So they have met the intent of the master plan by admitting me to the system, but if I choose not to enroll at Merced for personal reasons, I live in Sacramento, I wanted to go to UC Davis, I wanted to commute, I didn't necessarily have the wherewithal financially to live on campus or move away from home to go to school. And this was a strategy that the university embarked on. So if you flip to the next page of your graphics, we show this a little bit. So as you can see, the compare favorably hit. Again, we have the line where that particular policy was put in place. It was June of 2011. But just focusing on the last line, the 2014-15. So as you can see in the third column over 10,000 students were admitted to the University of California, but they were denied their campus of choice. They were referred to UC Merced. And this is not to be disparaging to Merced. We've heard concerns about that, and my office has nothing disparaging to say about Merced. It's just we're talking about this practice, and Merced is the only university starting in 2011 where students were being referred. And it was only resident students being referred. Non-residents, if a non-resident in a comparable situation that I just described applied to UC Davis or UC Berkeley and was admitted to the system, they were guaranteed placement and enrollment at one of those two campuses to which they applied. Looking back at this table, one of the concerns we had, and clearly one of the strategies is, typically a student who is admitted to the campus of choice, the far right column, is usually between 55, the last 3 years, 55% of the students who have been given at least one campus of choice, they choose to enroll at that particular campus. But as you can see on the table, for those students who are referred or put in the referral pool to Merced, that drops significantly. It's down to between 1% and 2% in the last 2 or 3 years. Most of those students who choose not to enroll, we don't know what happens to them, whether they choose to not go to college, whether they choose to go to college out of state, whether they've chosen to go into the CSU system. We really don't know. But it was really remarkable to us is seeing 10,688 students referred to Merced and only 195 choosing to enroll. And I have some information also that I'll discuss later where this really has an impact on the university's goals of increasing diversity, because I have some statistics related to underrepresented minorities in that group. It's relatively high. So in looking at Table 7, so the two policy decisions in 2008 related to the revenue, setting separate enrollment targets. 2011, they modified the admission requirement for non-resident students to compare favorably, and then they engage in referrals and referring more and more students to UC Merced. So consequences of the policy decisions. Well, clearly, one of the positives for the university is to increase revenue in the time of fiscal stress, and it certainly resulted in that. If you flip to the next page, there's a lot of information in this chart, and I will step you through some things. But as you will see, The university in the most recent fiscal year that we had information for, 14-15, the most recent completed fiscal year, the non-resident supplemental revenue was $728 million. That was a significant increase in the last few years, particularly prior to when they changed Compare Favorably, changed the admission standard. They were bringing in about a little over $300 million. So just in a 4-year window, they increased the non-resident supplemental tuition revenue by bringing in more and more non-resident students. In fact, one of the issues that is demonstrated in this table is clearly there were state appropriation cuts, the green boxes in the middle, and those occurred in 2008, 9, 9, 10, and 10, 11, 11, 12. But what you see is subsequent to that, the legislature and the governor beginning to restore some of those cuts. The shaded last 3 fiscal years, 12-13, 13-14, 14-15, the state general fund appropriation is increasing. But if you compare that to the bar charts in that section of the graph that's shaded, you can see that non-resident tuition revenue is increasing significantly, over $100 million a year. So even though the university is starting to regain and get some of those appropriations back from the legislature, the pace at which they are bringing in non-resident students hasn't slowed, it's actually accelerated. In fact, in 14-15, 1/3 of the students the university admitted were non-resident students, 26,000 students in that academic year. As I have been mentioning, the Compare Favorably, another consequence of some of these modifications and these policy changes in the strategy is that we're seeing, as you indicated, Mr. Chair, some non-residents coming into the university with lower academic qualifications than our resident students. And this is on Figure 6 if you go to page 5. So if you look at the most recent 3 academic years, you can see a grouping of about 16,000 students, 15,949 students. What that represents is non-resident students who were admitted to the University of California system, and across the board, their scores, their GPA scores, their SAT scores, their ACT scores, every single score was below the median of a California resident student. So those students clearly were benefiting from the Compare Favorably because they were not in the upper half or competing with the upper half of California resident students. Now, I did a little additional analysis of those 15,000 students. Not all of them enrolled in the university system. As we saw in a table earlier, not every student that's offered admittance to the system enrolls. But when we went back and looked at the numbers to see where did those students end up enrolling, 50% of the students that chose to enroll, of those 15,000, enrolled at Berkeley, UCLA, and San Diego. If you add Irvine, the percentage goes up to 71%. So clearly those students who, again, on all of the scores across the board, were below an average California resident, had the opportunity to enroll in a flagship school. If you look at Table 5, this is a similar analysis where we start seeing some trends. And what we did here is we took the weighted grade point average at all of the campuses and compared a resident student to a non-resident student. And as you can see, the red line where it's Compare Favorably, there is a shift, a trend, certainly at every single campus where you're seeing this weighted GPA is lower than the weighted GPA of resident students being admitted to those individual campuses. So it's across the board as far as the system itself, of course, other than Merced, but every other campus you can see the red boxes where their GPA for a non-resident student is lower. Similarly, in the next table, Table 8, there's an increasing number of non-residents enrolling in the most popular majors. So what we decided to do there is look at the 5 most popular majors that the university offers. As you can see, engineering, social sciences, business, and management. And on this chart, we've highlighted for you resident enrollment declined at 3 of the 4 campuses that we looked at, Berkeley, Irvine, and San Diego. At Los Angeles, it didn't decline overall. In some majors it did, but the overall for the majors we looked at, it did not. In contrast, non-resident enrollment increased in all of those majors across the board at all 4 campuses. Now, in looking at diversity, this is another issue that we were concerned about when we looked at the effects of some of these policy decisions. So the university, to its credit, has been trying to increase diversity to get it to a place where our university system here in California represents what our citizenry looks like as far as underrepresented minorities comprise about 45% of the state population. If you look at the very top of this chart, underrepresented minorities of resident students, they've done a good job. They've gone from 19% to 30%. The problem is, as we bring in more and more non-resident students, if you drop down to the non-resident domestic United States students, you can see that the vast majority of these individuals are Asian and white, and the underrepresented minorities is 11%. So that's really hampering. It's actually taking a step back in trying to increase diversity. And certainly when you bring in the non-residents, international students are primarily Asian, 91%. So this is really, in our view, hampering. By bringing in more and more non-resident students, it's hampering the university's efforts to try to get a student body that really reflects the diversity of our state. When I spoke earlier, let's go back. If I could ask you to take a flip back. I apologize. Okay, where's the table?
Page 4.
No, I want to go to page 2. Let's go back to page 2. And this is tying to diversity. So just focusing on the last 3 years in this table, the last 3 academic years, you can see 8,360 students were placed in the referral pool, 9,411, and then 10,688. So we went back and looked at an analysis of those students to determine it's on page 2, members. I apologize. I think this is an important point to make. So in those last 3 academic years, of those students, I said the 8,360, 9,400, and 10,688. 8,400 of those students were underrepresented minorities. 8,423 were referred to Merced over those 3 years. Of those 8,423 students, 215 chose to enroll at UC Merced. So the university lost the opportunity to offer students who met the UC qualifications to perhaps, and if they were given perhaps the campus of their choice, if we picked up 55 or 60% of those underrepresented minorities, we would have gained another 4,200 students. Instead, similar to what other students decide when they're referred to UC Merced, 8,200 of those underrepresented minorities chose not to enroll in Merced. So again, it really emphasizes this practice hampering the university's ability to have a more diverse population across all of its campuses. And going back to the last page in the handout, make it easy for you. The last issue that we identified as far as an issue that really caused us concern with respect to the policies and the implications and the effect of the policies is it's increasing non-resident enrollment is really exacerbating the per-student funding inequities. As I'm sure you're well aware, the university embarked on the rebenching of state funds to try to equalize funding across all of the campuses. If you look at this chart, you see the dark bars. The dark portion of the bar charts is the state funding where they're trying to equalize, and it's coming relatively close. Most of them are around, the mid 6,000s. There's a couple of flagship schools that are a little higher, but they are getting to, they're making progress as far as rebenching. The decision to allow the universities to keep the non-resident supplemental tuition is the light green bar. So essentially, by allowing those campuses to recruit and retain the supplemental tuition revenue from the students that they enroll at their campuses, again, benefits San Diego, Los Angeles, and Berkeley, the flagship schools. Their funding, total funding now, is significantly higher than all of the other campuses. The other important element of this chart is the percentages in Burgundy. That is the number of underrepresented minorities at those campuses. So again, those campuses are benefiting from the non-resident tuition coming in. They're enrolling non-resident students, and they are falling behind as far as trying to bring in more and have a more and more diverse population at their campuses. So all of those issues that we identified in the report really led us to the conclusion that resident students are really being disadvantaged by a variety of these different policies that were enacted back in 2008 and certainly in 2011 when the Compare Favorably went into effect. Some of the recommendations that we made in the report, we felt that based on the trends that we have seen, the fact that even though the legislature and the governor are beginning to restore, we're not suggesting that it's fully restored, but beginning to restore some of the appropriations provided to the university system, yet non-resident enrollment continues to increase at a very rapid pace, and the amount of non-resident revenue coming in, especially at the flagship schools, really led us to some specific recommendations that we felt the legislature needed to endorse or implement. First is with respect to setting a limit on the percentage of non-resident students that the university can enroll each year. We certainly saw that prior to the fiscal crisis, the percentage of non-resident students was about 5%. That's what we suggested. I understand that may be a very strict and low percentage. We also looked at a report that the university put together back in 2010 called the Commission on the Future. It was a group of individuals, various work groups put together. There were regents on these work groups, chancellors from various universities, executives from the university system, office of the president, faculty, etc. In their report back in 2010, they made a recommendation to increase non-resident enrollment. And not just specifically for fiscal benefit, just to bring in more non-resident students. However, they cautioned in their recommendation that if the percentage of non-resident students goes beyond 10%, it will displace California resident students. So they suggested that there would be a 10% cap on non-resident enrollment in the UC system. They also suggested that if there's going to be a referral process for resident students, there should be a referral process for non-resident students. And then they also suggested that the Office of the President monitor the campuses to ensure that they stay within the 10% cap for non-resident enrollment. So we think this is a viable, reasonable recommendation that we've made, and certainly the university system back in 2010, some of their experts and executives felt the same way. We also make a recommendation that the legislature consider basing the university's annual appropriation upon agreed-upon percentages of enrollment for resident and non-resident students. We also think that the university, the legislature should require the university to prepare a biennial cost study, because one of the things that we tried to do during the course of this audit is really get at what does it actually cost to educate a student in California. And you often hear $10,000 per student from the university. So when we ask them questions, okay, so if we bring in 3 non-resident students, then we have some additional revenue where we can bring in a resident student. And they didn't necessarily agree with that type of analysis, so we kept pressing them on that. But really, we weren't able to get a definitive answer as far as how do you come up with the $10,000 per student. Also, the final recommendation we made to the legislature is that the legislature should consider excluding students that the university refers that ultimately do not enroll when we're assessing whether or not the university is meeting the master plan, bringing in that 12.5%, because we actually did an analysis. If you excluded the referred students, the university would have fell below the 12.5% requirement, the upper eighth of high school graduates. We had some additional recommendations to the university as far as the Compare Favorably standard. We think that needs to change. We think that really does disadvantage California resident students. So those were the key issues with respect to the enrollment and some of the practices that have occurred in the last few years. But before I finish, I just wanted to touch on some other aspects of the audit report where clearly everyone went through the fiscal crisis that this state and the country endured for several years, and I understand there's discussion in the audit report. We acknowledge that the legislature and the governor had to make difficult decisions and cut the UC's budget, much like you had to cut budgets of other state agencies. But what we were disappointed to see is that the university didn't really sufficiently go back and look at its costs and determine where could we cut costs before resorting to increasing tuition or embarking on the strategy of bringing in more and more non-resident students to increase the revenue for the system. In fact, in the last 10 years, as I'm sure you're aware, mandatory fees for resident students have doubled since 2005-06, from $6,000 to about $12,000 15-16. The other issue two or three issues I'd like to discuss with respect to costs, despite the fiscal crisis, the university increased its spending on employee costs, and it's not just bringing in more employees. There were actually about a 15% increase in the number of employees, but a 64% increase in the amount of money spent on salaries and wages and employee costs. In fact, in one particular year when the legislature cut, it was the biggest cut that the university endured. That very same year, they provided a general salary increase that was almost the same amount as the cut, $600 million increase. Now, the university did furlough their employees for 11 months. They generated $236 million from those furloughs, but the very next year they negated those savings by increasing salaries by over $500 million. So again, where we're critical here is the practices, decisions, choices that the University of California made, not only with respect to their policies and some of their standards, but really not necessarily looking internally and saying, what can we do as a system to cut our costs to try to make sure that we can enroll as many California resident students as possible, give them the opportunity to get a UC education. There are some other issues that we had in the report. I'm going to skip over those, but I want to talk about two others. Working Smarter initiative, I'm sure many of you have heard. The university takes tremendous pride in the fact that they put this initiative together, 34 projects. For 13 of those projects, they suggested that they generated $664 million in savings and new revenue just in the last 4 years. What we as auditors do, prove it to us, show us, validate those numbers. And the Office of the President was not able to provide any information to us that substantiated those amounts. They gave us some spreadsheets, they gave us some information, but we clearly could not confirm the savings or the new revenue. In addition, the university asserted that they redirected most of those savings towards academic and research missions. But when we pressed them and asked them for, again, information to substantiate those claims, they were not able to substantiate the claims. And in fact, the initiative director said much of the savings and revenue, $460 million, indirectly benefited students. It wasn't really directed at academic and its research mission. The final issue related to the Work Smarter initiative is the Board of Regents, when they asked the university and the campuses to engage in these cost savings efforts, the regents directed the Office of the President to mandate that every campus participate in the initiatives. But the Office of the President chose to allow campuses to voluntarily participate. And we had some concern with that because there were some programs that we thought would be relatively easy as far as cost savings. A managed travel program where we're leveraging, the university is leveraging the fact that it's a major institution across the state, using similar to what state employees use a travel program to keep those travel costs down. And we estimated at least an additional $9 million if they had at least gotten to 80% participation. Their participation was around 46% of the campuses participating. So again, decisions, choices, what is the university doing really to be proactive in trying to save costs to benefit students in California? Another issue that I will just touch on very quickly, I know members were concerned at the hearing last year on the previous audit as far as the expenditures on non-resident recruiting. In the last 5 years, the amount spent that we could isolate increased 400% from about $900,000 to $4.5 million, specifically for recruiting non-resident students. What we weren't able to do is separate out the salary and wages of the individuals engaging in those efforts. We only could identify distinct costs, but it's still a significant increase in their expenditures for that purpose. And then the last issue, in the interest of time, was there are various programs that the university is not really monitoring those programs. The total cost of those programs on an annual basis is about $337 million. And what we felt that the university could do is really take a look at some of those programs and determine whether or not they need to continue to be supported with state funding. What the legislature and the governor allowed the university to do is, in the past, there was money earmarked for specific programs. The governor backed off and said, okay, we'll eliminate those earmarks. We'll give you flexibility to make decisions as to which programs you continue to invest state monies in, or whether you decide to phase some of those out because those programs are successful. First thing, the university did not do an across-the-board analysis of the programs. Many of these programs don't directly benefit students. They're beneficial programs, but they don't directly relate to students. So what we felt is the university should have done an analysis. Well, in fact, they analyzed a handful. There's 3 programs that the university identified and pointed out to us that if they either pared the amount of state funding provided to those programs back, or just suggested that those programs are really successful, could be self-supporting with other revenues, that it would free up about $45 million a year, just 3 programs. So again, it's really the concern or criticism that we have in the report is that the university, again, needs to be proactive in doing analyses to try to identify funding that could be freed up, that could be directed towards bringing in and allowing more California resident students to enroll, to get admitted and enroll in the UC system. We had a variety of recommendations to the university with respect to the Working Smarter initiative, also in tracking spending for programs, reevaluating programs each year, being more transparent with some of the state funding that they allocate out and their per-student funding. So with that, Mr. Chair, we'd be happy to answer any questions members may have. That's kind of a high-level synopsis of the issues in the report.